What do you do when the door you knock on for rent opens to a child who's not just behind on payment, but about to unravel everything about your family, your fortune, and yourself? When millionaire landlord Richard Coleman knocked on the door of apartment 4B, he expected excuses, maybe a confrontation. What he found instead was a 10-year-old black girl sewing, like her family's future depended on it. Because it did. Zoe's fingers were wrapped in bandages, her voice calm, her dignity louder than any apology. She wasn't just paying rent, she was holding together the legacy of a mother silenced by illness, and a corporation built on stolen labor. What Richard didn't know, standing there in his designer suit and fragile authority, was that this quiet girl would unravel more than a seam. She'd exposed the very thread that stitched his empire together, and who it was stolen from, and by the time she was done, she wouldn't just change his company, she'd rewrite his bloodline. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. It started on a Thursday, one of those brisk spring mornings when the air in Boston had more bark than bite. Richard's assistant had flagged an overdue account, 2 weeks behind in a building he barely remembered owning. The kind of place you invest in for long-term returns, not curb appeal. Still, pride made him show up in person. He wanted to remind his team that no unit, no matter how small, was beneath attention. His leather shoes echoed down the cracked hallway of Coleman Estates like they didn't belong there, because they didn't. When he knocked, the door creaked open with the tired groan of a hinge that hadn't seen oil since the Obama administration. What greeted him was not a tenant pleading for more time, but a child threading a needle like she was suturing the roof back onto her life. Zoe didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She looked him square in the eye and said, "My mother is sleeping." Her voice wasn't trembling, it was tempered. When she looked up, there was a quiet dignity that completely disarmed him. In the corner, piles of colorful fabric were folded with surgical precision. The sewing machine whirred with steady defiance as if daring him to interrupt. "I'm here about the rent," Richard said, adjusting his cufflinks like armor. "You're 2 weeks late." Zoe stood, walked to a wooden box, pulled out a crumpled envelope and handed it to him. "It's half. The rest comes when I finish these dresses." Her fingers trembled only from exhaustion, not fear. And that's what shook him. He took the envelope, counted the bills. Worn, soft at the edges like they'd changed hands too many times to remember where they began. He wanted to ask where her father was, or why she wasn't in school, or how someone so small could carry something so heavy without breaking, but his mouth was dry and his mind was busy trying to calculate where dignity fits on a spreadsheet. Behind the bedroom curtain, a wet cough broke the silence. Zoe didn't even turn. "She's sick. I take care of her," just like that. No drama, no begging, just the facts. Like a junior executive delivering quarterly results. She sat back down, returned to the machine, and began stitching again. Richard left without another word. Walked back to his Tesla like a man who'd just lost an argument he didn't know he was in. The air outside was colder than before, or maybe it was the chill of realizing that some stories don't announce themselves with headlines. Some arrive in whispers, in broken needles, in a girl's silence that says more than any speech. What unsettled him wasn't the unpaid rent, it was the realization that this child wasn't looking for pity. She was holding a system together with nothing but thread, willpower, and a handmade invoice. He had come to collect money, but she was the one keeping the lights on. Richard was in the middle of a quarterly review when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, he'd let it go to voicemail. Unsaved numbers were usually vendors, reporters, or worse, distant cousins with business ideas. But something tugged. He stepped out of the boardroom, ignoring the side eyes from his partners. The voice on the other end was calm, but clinical. "Mr. Coleman, this is Mercy Hospital. You've been listed as the emergency contact for a patient, Elaine Williams." For a moment, he said nothing. The name didn't click. Then, Zoe. Apartment 4B. The girl with the bandaged fingers and a backbone made of braided steel. He didn't remember giving anyone his number, but somehow it made perfect sense that she would list him, After all, in her world, ownership meant responsibility, and right now she needed someone to show up. When Richard arrived at Mercy, he was met with the sterile brightness of polished linoleum floors and institutional indifference. The waiting area smelled like lemon cleaner and unresolved tension. At the far end, Zoe sat alone on a bench, legs swinging, back straight. She looked smaller than he remembered, but older too. Her hands were in her lap, still, but her eyes were red-rimmed. Not the kind of red from sobbing hysterically. No, this was the quiet kind of crying, the kind that happened in silence, in corners, when nobody was looking. He approached slowly, half worried she'd reject him on sight, but she just looked up and said, "They won't let me in." Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it sounded annoyed. Richard glanced around, confused. "Why not?" She shrugged like it was obvious. "I'm too young. They said a child can't be in the ICU alone. They asked me for a responsible adult." Her gaze flicked up to him, unreadable. "So I gave them your number." "You own our house. That means you're in charge." He didn't know whether to laugh or apologize. The logic was childish, yes, but also flawless in its own warped brilliance. Landlords knock on doors. Doctors ask questions. In Zoe's mind, they were probably the same species. Adults who made decisions. Gatekeepers. Her line of thinking wasn't just innocent, it was strategic. She wore exhaustion like armor, creased but never cracked. They sat in silence for a minute, her shoulder brushing against his sleeve every time she shifted. He finally asked, "How long has she been sick?" "A while," Zoe said. "Pneumonia, but it got worse. She was still working until last week." Richard frowned. "Working?" Zoe nodded. "From home. Seamstress. People send us orders. I finish what she can't. She hasn't been able to sit up since Monday, but Mrs. Patterson said she still needs the prom dresses by Friday, so I've been doing those at night." Her words fell out casually, like she was reciting a homework assignment. He stared at her, incredulous. "Wait. You run the sewing business?" She shrugged again. "Someone has to. Mom can't. The bills don't pause just because you're tired." There was no drama in her voice, no pity-fishing, just facts. Bullet points. If she'd had a PowerPoint, it would have said, "Elaine, ICU. Zoe, Operations Manager. Rent, pending. Revenue stream, Patterson clientele." Richard exhaled and leaned back against the bench. He came to collect rent. He found the COO of Apartment 4B, and somehow even that felt like an understatement. He glanced at her again. This girl sitting in the emergency wing of a hospital with red eyes, a stiff spine, and no backup plan but her own two hands. She wasn't waiting for anyone to save her. She was waiting for her shift to end. Eventually, a nurse in soft green scrubs came out and called for Mr. Coleman. He stood, unsure what to say to Zoe. "Can I see her?" he asked. The nurse glanced at Zoe, then back at him, clearly skeptical. "Only immediate family." Before Richard could answer, Zoe stood beside him. "He's my uncle," she said, so smoothly that even he almost believed it. The nurse frowned, scanned the pair. White man in a pressed suit, black girl in faded jeans and fraying braids, and hesitated. But something in Zoe's tone must have hit the right note. The nurse waved them through. As they walked toward the ICU, Richard glanced down and saw that Zoe's fists were balled so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Yet her chin was up. Eyes forward. Ready. Inside, Elaine Williams lay beneath a blanket of tubes and blinking monitors. She looked even smaller than Zoe. Pale, thin. The strength that Zoe wore had clearly come from her, passed down like a family heirloom. As Richard stood quietly beside the bed, something inside him began to shift. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just the moment he stepped into responsibility. It was the moment the cost of his inheritance began to stare back at him. And what stared back wasn't numbers or margins. It was a child, running a life her parents never had time to build. The next morning, just as Richard arrived at the hospital with a bag of clean clothes for Zoe, the real storm blew in. A woman in a stiff blazer with a laminated badge and a tablet under one arm stood near the nurse's station like she owned it. She didn't smile, didn't blink much either. "Mr. Coleman?" she asked. "I'm Deanna Morris, Child Protective Services. I need to speak with Zoe Williams regarding her temporary placement while her mother remains hospitalized." The words landed like ice water. Zoe, who had been standing beside Richard a second earlier, suddenly shrank, not in size, but in certainty. Her shoulders tensed, her fingers curled tight, and for the first time since he'd met her, that calm, businesslike mask began to crack. "They're going to take me away," she whispered, barely audible. "If she's here more than 3 days, they find out I'm alone, they'll put me in a shelter. They almost did last time." Her words were matter-of-fact, but her eyes screamed the panic she refused to let into her voice. Diana stepped forward. "Zoe, do you have any relatives we can contact? An aunt? A godparent?" Zoe didn't answer. Her jaw was clenched too tight to speak. Before Richard could even think through what he was doing, the words left his mouth. "She's under my care," he said, louder than he intended. "I'm taking responsibility. Her mother asked me to look after her." Diana turned, raising a brow. "And you are?" "Richard Coleman. I'm the property owner where they live," he replied. "I've been helping since her mother was admitted, temporarily." There was a pause, the kind of pause that fills elevators before someone breaks tension with a cough or an excuse. "Do you have any documentation stating that she's in your custody?" Diana asked, already knowing the answer. Richard hesitated. "I can have it drawn up today. I have a legal team." Zoe turned to him, blinking like she wasn't sure if what she heard was real. It wasn't a lie. It was a premonition. He didn't know what it meant yet, only that there was no version of this story where he could walk away clean. Not anymore. They let Zoe walk out with him under the condition that documents would be submitted by end of day. At his penthouse, the silence hit first, not the quiet of rest, but the heavy kind, the type that comes from unfamiliar air, rich furnishings, and a view too high for comfort. Zoe stood in the middle of the foyer, unsure whether to take her shoes off or run for the door. "You can pick any room you want," Richard said gently. "It's your place now, too." She looked up at him, expression steady. "I'd rather be near my mom." Her voice wasn't rude, just honest. She dropped her bag by the edge of the couch and pulled out a plastic grocery sack. Inside were scraps of fabric, chalk, a worn measuring tape, and a half-finished dress. "Mrs. Patterson paid me in advance," she added, already setting up at the table. "I need to finish these. It's my responsibility." Richard stood back and watched as she arranged her things like it was just another day at the office. No cartoons, no cell phone, no wide-eyed awe at marble countertops or floor-to-ceiling windows. This girl didn't carry a teddy bear. She carried invoices. As she threaded the needle with the same tired grace he remembered, he made a call to Martin Goldstein, his longtime attorney. "I need temporary guardianship paperwork. Today," Richard said, "and I need it to hold up under scrutiny." There was a pause on the line. "Richard, you do realize this is not typical," Martin replied. "You're a single man with no children, no prior relationship with this girl. Social services is going to scrutinize everything." "I don't care," Richard replied. "She's not going to a shelter." He hung up before Martin could talk him down. Meanwhile, across town, a silver BMW idled on a quiet street facing the hospital. Inside, Victoria Reynolds sat with her phone held up just low enough not to be noticed, camera zoomed in. Snap. A photo of Richard walking out with Zoe. Snap. A shot of them getting into the same car. Her lips curled into a satisfied smile. To her, this wasn't just gossip, it was strategy. Richard, the rising star of the Coleman board, had just handed her the perfect scandal. She didn't need to invent a narrative, she just had to wait for the world to jump to conclusions, and if she played it right, the board would have no choice but to question his judgment. After all, a man risking corporate reputation for a tenant's child? That kind of kindness looked reckless on paper. Back in the penthouse, Zoe was already stitching when Richard walked in with a tray of sandwiches he had no idea how to make. She barely looked up. "You don't have to keep doing all this," she said. "I've been managing fine." Richard sat down, placing the tray beside her. "I believe you, but just because you can survive on your own doesn't mean you should have to." She didn't answer, but her hands slowed, and for the first time he saw her breathe. Not just function, breathe. It wouldn't last long. They both knew that. Papers were coming, questions were coming, but for now, in a skyscraper far removed from apartment 4B, the sewing machine hummed. And the man who once measured people by payment dates started to learn what real value looked like, stitched by hand between silence and stubbornness, one responsibility at a time. Richard thought he was taking Zoe in to protect her. What he didn't realize was that while he was busy calling lawyers and warding off boardroom politics, she was quietly taking notes. Not in any official way, not with spreadsheets or charts. No, Zoe used what she had, a worn-out school notebook, the same one she brought back and forth between the hospital and Richard's penthouse. On the outside it was multiplication tables and vocabulary words, but tucked between those lessons was something else. Something alive, something watching. Because Zoe didn't just adapt, she documented. She noticed everything. Every phone call Richard took with his lawyer, every name he muttered while pacing, every document he left half open on the dining table after a long night. He'd assumed she was too busy sewing, too tired, too young to notice the fine print of adult conversations. But while her fingers worked the needle, her ears worked overtime. She remembered names, dates. She began asking questions that seemed innocent at first. What does escrow mean? Or who's on the company board? But behind her casual tone was a mind threading things together with surgical precision. If Sherlock Holmes had pigtails and a Singer sewing machine, her name would be Zoe Williams. The more she heard, the deeper the mystery got. And one night, while flipping through a stack of old building reports that Richard had left on the coffee table, she saw something that made her stop mid-stitch. A name. Her mother's. Elaine Williams, listed under original staff for the first Coleman Estates project. She blinked hard, stared at it, then flipped the page back and forth as if trying to find the trick. A line item showed, "Employee agreement, non-compensatory," followed by avoided contract. No signatures, just notes. She closed the document quietly, stood up, and walked to her backpack where the notebook waited. She didn't write anything down that night, she just drew a square, labeled it, missing pieces. Over the next several days, her questions became more focused. "How long has your family owned the company?" she asked Richard casually one morning as he poured coffee. He shrugged. "Since my grandfather, but the big expansion started with my dad." She nodded, then asked, "Did your dad work with everyone who lived in our building?" He looked up, surprised. "I think so, back then. It was a small operation." Then he added, "Why?" She didn't answer, just returned to her sewing. But later that night, she pulled a dusty box from under her mother's hospital bed, one Elaine had always guarded. Inside were old clippings, handwritten letters and designs on yellowed paper. One headline caught her breath. "Coleman Estates breaks ground, promises equity to early employees." Below it, a grainy photo. William Coleman shaking hands with seamstresses. And there her mother, barely 20, standing in the background, smiling in a handmade uniform. She turned the page, found another clipping, this one with a protest outside a Coleman building. The words "Stock Betrayal" scrawled on a cardboard sign. She flipped back to her notebook, wrote, "Something happened. They were promised shares. They never got them. But why?" Then a name surfaced again and again in those letters. Victoria Reynolds, legal counsel at the time, now board chair. The picture was getting clearer. Too clear. What do you call justice, stitched one thread at a time? A reckoning. By the end of the week, her notebook had grown fat with sticky notes and diagrams. It looked like something a detective might bring to a trial, not a child to school. She slipped it into her backpack and waited. Because this wasn't just about unpaid rent anymore. It wasn't about sick moms and CPS and prom dresses. It was about a promise broken so quietly that no one thought anyone would remember. But someone did. A little girl with calloused hands and a gift for patterns, not just on fabric, but in truth. When Richard found her cross-legged on the floor one night, flipping through those clippings again, he didn't say anything. He just asked, "What are you working on?" Zoe didn't answer right away. She closed the notebook gently, stood and handed it to him. "Page 27, Mr. Coleman," she said, looking him dead in the eye. "Look closely." Then she walked out of the room, leaving behind not a cry for help, but the fuse of something much bigger. Something that was no longer waiting for someone to fix it. Something that was about to expose the exact moment when a business became an empire, by stealing everything that belonged to people like her mother. And Zoe? She wasn't done. She was just getting started. The invitation was dressed up as a formality, but the tone told a different story. "Extraordinary session of the Coleman Estates Board," the email said. "Urgent." Richard had barely finished reading when Martin called. "She's moving fast," his lawyer warned. "Victoria's got something up her sleeve and she's aiming it at you. I've heard she's going to question your capacity to lead. That notebook Zoe gave you, bring it." Richard didn't hesitate. He slipped the notebook into his briefcase right beside his laptop, then straightened his tie in the mirror. This wasn't just a board meeting, it was a trial. When he walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor, the air was already thick with rehearsed concern. 9 board members sat in a row like jurors who'd already received their instructions. Victoria Reynolds, pristine in a gray suit, wore a smile so sharp it could bleed through wallpaper. She stood slowly, as if the whole room had been waiting for her to rise. "Gentlemen," she began, "I've called this meeting because a serious problem compromises the image of Coleman Estates." Behind her, the projection screen flickered to life. "Photos have surfaced of our CEO escorting a minor, Zoe Williams, out of a social services office. A minor with no family ties to him, no legal arrangement, no documentation." A low hum rippled through the room. One of the board members adjusted his glasses. Another scratched the corner of his notepad but didn't look up. Victoria continued. "While this may appear to be an act of charity, it exposes the company to enormous legal liability. Mr. Coleman's actions were unsanctioned, unprofessional, and in light of his emotional involvement with this child and her mother, I propose a temporary leave of absence while the board evaluates his judgment and leadership fitness." She folded her hands and sat down like a judge who had just slammed the gavel on her own verdict. Richard didn't speak at first. He just opened his laptop. The screen behind him shifted as he connected to the projector. "Before you vote," he said evenly, "I'd like to share some context." Click. The first document appeared, an employee agreement from over 20 years ago. On it, Elaine Williams' signature in blue ink. "This," Richard said, "is the original contract signed between Coleman Estates and its first group of employees. It promised stock options in exchange for their work on the initial properties." Click. The second document loaded. Same format. But this time, the contract showed no shares. A forged version, with Victoria Reynolds' signature, authorizing the change. "This," he said, "is what replaced it." The room went still. Click. Email exchanges appeared, one after another. Conversations between Victoria and Richard's father. Plans to quietly void the original agreements, to remove rights from employees who were unlikely to complain. Mostly black workers, mostly undocumented, mostly invisible. Every click of the projector was another nail in Victoria's coffin. No one interrupted. No one coughed. They just watched the pile of evidence build like snow on a collapsing roof. Martin Goldstein stood at the edge of the room, arms folded. "These documents have already been sent to the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and 3 major media outlets," he said calmly. "So by all means continue discussing Mr. Coleman's emotional judgment. But be advised, anything said in this room is already being heard elsewhere." Victoria tried to stand. Her chair screeched against the floor louder than any of her previous declarations. "This is a setup," she barked. "These are documents forged by a child, by a tenant. They don't hold legal weight." Richard turned slowly. "Actually, these are originals, found in my father's archived files, verified by our internal auditor and legal counsel. And that child you're so quick to dismiss, she's the reason any of this came to light." He turned to the board. "Her name is Zoe Williams. Her mother helped build this company, and I came to collect rent. But she collected justice." The silence was no longer uncertain. It was stunned. One of the senior board members, a man who had been with Coleman Estates since its early days, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I remember those contracts," he muttered. "There was talk, rumors, but your father swore everyone had been compensated." Richard nodded slowly. "That was a lie, perpetuated by people who benefited from it, including Victoria." He paused, letting the weight settle. "You want to talk about company image? Look at what we've been hiding." By the end of the meeting, the board demanded Victoria's immediate resignation. The vote was unanimous. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply packed her briefcase, her face pale, and walked out of the room she once ruled. But not before turning back to Richard and whispering, "You'll regret this." He met her eyes with the calm of someone who had already faced regret and chosen not to live there. As the door clicked shut behind her, Richard sat down for the first time, tired but lighter. Not because he had won, but because something had finally been set right. He looked around the table and said only one thing more. "We don't move forward by ignoring where we came from. We move forward by fixing it." And across town, in a sewing room turned strategy bunker, Zoe Williams marked a quiet check next to a single line in her notebook. Step 5, make them listen. The news didn't break. It detonated. Within days of the boardroom ambush, Richard ordered a full internal audit of every early Coleman Estates contract, beginning with the names in Zoe's notebook. What started as a gesture quickly became a reckoning. Dozens of discrepancies, dozens of erased promises, and all traced back to that same decade. The same signatures, but the part no one saw coming, the test. Richard didn't talk about it, not with Martin, not with the board, not even with Zoe. But he submitted his DNA to a private lab just to confirm what his gut had already started whispering the night she handed him that notebook. When the results came in, the papers didn't shake in his hands, but everything else did. Elaine Williams had once been more than a seamstress, and Zoe? She wasn't just someone else's child. She was his. At the press conference, cameras clicked like insects. Reporters leaned forward, sensing the kind of story that cracks legacies open and bleeds truth onto polished floors. Richard stood at the podium, pale but resolute. "I'm here today not as a CEO, but as a man trying to make right what should never have been made wrong. Zoe Williams is not just the daughter of a woman this company once exploited. She is my daughter." The room froze. Breath collectively held. The Coleman name has stood for power and property, but it should also stand for accountability. Today, I'm renaming this company. Effective immediately, we are Coleman and Williams Holdings. The announcement rippled through the industry like lightning through a copper wire. Stock analysts fumbled for statements, real estate blogs crashed from traffic. But inside the company, something else began to shift. Richard didn't stop at words. He signed into effect the Coleman Reparation Fund, transferring 40% of his personal shares into a trust for the original employees and their descendants. For those who had passed away with no known heirs, the money would fund scholarships for black students in underfunded districts across Boston. "Wealth without restoration," Richard said, "is theft in slow motion." 2 days later, Elaine opened her eyes. Her breath came in shallow sips, but she was awake. A nurse stepped aside as Richard and Zoe entered the room together. Elaine's gaze was foggy at first, but when it landed on her daughter, standing beside the man whose name used to be printed on their rent statements. She smiled faintly. "You two," she whispered. "You finally met." Zoe squeezed her hand gently. "I told you I was good at sewing," and somehow in that moment they all laughed. Not loud, not long, but she didn't just mend clothes, she stitched history back together. And while Elaine rested, the world kept turning. Victoria Reynolds, now stripped of her title, was formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. The press loved the fall from grace narrative, but Richard didn't indulge it. He had no interest in revenge. Only restoration. As arrests were made and hearings scheduled, the company began holding community meetings, real ones, with tenants, activists, and legacy families. For the first time, decisions weren't made behind tinted glass, but in church basements and school auditoriums. The Coleman empire wasn't just rebranding, it was rebuilding, from the foundation up. One evening, Richard stood alone in his office, watching dusk paint the skyline in strokes of gold and ash. He thought about his father, about the speeches, the awards, the dinners where deals were made over brandy and backslaps. He thought about how power had once been a birthright handed down like cufflinks. But now, standing on the other side of it, he understood something he never had before. Real inheritance isn't land. It's how you answer for the ground you walk on. He turned toward Zoe's latest sketch, framed on the wall, bold lines, steady detail, and smiled. She had redrawn more than a brand. She had redrawn the story. In the end, no headline captured the full weight of what had changed. They tried, but there was no banner big enough to hold it all. Not the daughter hidden in plain sight, not the mother who never stopped protecting her, not the CEO who finally understood that leadership isn't control, it's accountability. In a city where so many stories were buried under concrete and glass, one girl had picked up a needle and thread and dared to pull the truth out, one stitch at a time. 6 months later, the old apartment building on Archer Street didn't look anything like it used to. The cracked steps had been replaced with a ramp and a hand-painted welcome sign that read "The Pattern Project." Where peeling paint once flaked into the air, murals now wrapped the walls with bold color. Silhouettes of girls sewing, hands raised, dreams stitched into fabric. Inside what was once a neglected housing unit now echoed with the sound of laughter, the whir of machines, and the hum of ambition. It wasn't just an arts and sewing school. It was a second chance wrapped in thread and purpose. Zoe, barely 12, stood at the front of the main room like she'd owned it all along. She was teaching 3 girls how to cut clean lines through thick fabric, her voice steady, confident, a little sassy. Elaine, stronger now and full of quiet command, led the older teens and young women in the back studio, mentoring, guiding, showing them not just how to sew, but how to build something that couldn't be stolen. Every stitch was a lesson in independence, every design a blueprint for dignity. Richard sat in the back row of Zoe's classroom one afternoon, just watching. Not managing, not fixing, just watching. The girl he once thought needed saving had become a force bigger than any rescue. The shame wasn't what you found, Zoe had told him earlier that week without judgment. It's what you never looked for. He hadn't responded. There was nothing to say. She wasn't blaming him. She was educating him. And he was listening. Deeply. Because it turned out justice doesn't wear robes. Sometimes it wears a measuring tape and keeps pins in its braid. Victoria Reynolds was sentenced that spring, 9 years, fraud, obstruction, theft of labor. The newspapers had a field day. But the headlines weren't about her. They were about Zoe, the girl who rewrote a dynasty, one called her. Another dubbed her the stitch that unraveled the silence. Reporters came, cameras flashed, but Zoe never played the victim. She credited her mother, her community. And quietly once, she said thank you to Richard. Not because he saved her, but because he stepped aside and let her lead. Weeks later, Richard was going through the last of his father's locked files when he found it, A small box hidden behind a drawer panel. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, designs for uniforms, jackets, custom tailoring, all dated and signed E.W. They weren't business concepts. They were art. Elaine's art. Richard ran his thumb along the corner of one drawing, a school blazer with curved seams and elegant symmetry, the same blazer his father had turned into the company's flagship design. Without credit, without compensation. Richard closed the box, exhaled, and drove straight to Elaine. She was sitting by the window in her modest new apartment, sorting thread colors. Zoe was out teaching when Richard handed her the box. She didn't open it right away. She just looked at him. He said quietly, "You always knew, even when we didn't." She opened the lid slowly, like lifting the past. Her eyes scanned the drawings. She smiled. "I never did it for credit. I did it because I loved it." "That's why it worked." He nodded. "That's why it still does." That night, the three of them sat together, Elaine with her sketches, Zoe drafting her next curriculum, Richard sipping tea like he'd finally figured out where he belonged. Not in charge, not on top, but in place. A place that had once been lost to silence and shame, now filled with purpose and peace. 3 generations, 1 thread, and a future finally sown with truth. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.